Welcome to episode 41 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, a professor in the School of Architecture, where I direct the MS in Urban Design. Those of you in person have been looking at the list of the first 20 episodes. So now you can get to see really some of the additional. We have a total of 40 episodes already recorded. So today, I'm delighted to host Redesigning Cities for Climate Migration. More on that in a minute, but all of these widely varying subjects are available on the Redesigning Cities website and our YouTube and Podomatic channels. So take a look and catch up on any you may have missed. At this point, while you have I'd like to invite you to take out your phones and get ready to do a screen capture of these upcoming episodes, because we're really very excited. We're going to have a really busy March. Next Monday, March 24, we will have Natasha Reed-Rice, who is executive with Habitat for Humanity International, to speak on creating beloved and thriving communities now. Then that same week on Wednesday, Neil Payton, who is an urban designer and partner at Torti Gallis, and Sarah Nurmela, the mayor of Westminster, Colorado, will be talking about the city as developer from Dead Mall to downtown, and a really actually very successful example of the city of Westminster acting as developer, converting their downtown, retrofitting it. Then on Monday, March 31, we will have an episode, title still TBA, with Anthony Townsend, but more or less redesigning cities with urban AI. And Anthony Townsend is a very well-known follower of technology, leader of technology, really, at the Urban Tech Hub in Cornell Tech. Today's episode is a topic that is both super sobering, full of unknowns, and yet incredibly relevant to the future of cities: climate migration. I'm thrilled that Abrahm Lustgarten has pulled together what is known and will share with us his research on why, when, and where people move after wildfires, heat, drought, flood, or sea level rise have made their home unlivable. After his presentation, Jairo Garcia, Camille Cortes, and Matt Lambert will join me in a conversation with Abrahm about what cities need to be doing to prepare for massive shifts in population, as well as in where the population on the move is going to find adequate water and food to sustain them. Abrahm Lustgarten is an award-winning author and investigative reporter for ProPublica and the New York Times Magazine, where he covers climate change. He has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, co-producer for a Discovery Channel film on killing the Colorado River, a PBS Frontline documentary about the Deepwater Horizon tragedy, and his early investigation into fracking received a George Polk Award. He is a graduate of Columbia University and Cornell, and the author of several books: A Run to Failure about BP, China's Great Train, about China's colonialization of Tibet, and this past year, On the Move, the Overheating Earth and the Uprooting of America, which is the subject of today's talk. So welcome, Abrahm. I'm going to stop sharing and invite you to share your screen and talk to us. Oops, you're muted, Abrahm.
Great way to start. Sounds good. I'm happy to be here today. It's really an honor to speak with you this evening. Atlanta, as you may know, is one of the places I've thought deeply about in the course of my research, and it's a vibrant city at the crossroads of how America is warming and the effects of that warming, and it's a city that's embracing its challenges. I wish I was there in person to talk to you about it this afternoon, but this big picture is what I do want to talk to you about today, and it's something I believe is so important to the future balance and stability of the world, and that is the future of human migration. I believe we're entering an era of mass migration driven by climate change, and that mass movement is a new permanent feature of our world in flux. It promises to complicate and implicate vast regions and populations of the planet, and it will forever alter the economy and the demographic makeup of the US and its cities. Throughout history, people have always moved in response to their climate. Somewhere between 60 and 80,000 years ago, the earliest Homo sapiens fled Africa because of drought, chasing a bounty of greenbelt vegetation northward, and ultimately spreading across the Middle East and walking as far as Australia as the Ice Age lowered sea levels. And then, only later, with the retreat of those glaciers exposing verdant northern latitudes, could people settle on the European continent and beyond. And that has been the role of the environment in shaping where people live on the planet for all the ages since. 3,000 years ago, the Indus Valley emptied out because of drought. Some anthropologists believe that 1,100 years ago, Mayan civilization crumbled in the face of water shortages. 900 years ago, Chinese herders moved thousands of miles northward onto the Russian tundra, seeking new pastures as the plains of Asia thawed. And ever since, humans have been driven across continents by ambition and by persecution and by aggression and curiosity and evangelism, but looming larger than perhaps anything else were changes in their climate. And so migration is the ultimate form of environmental adaptation. But now is different. Climate change is happening faster than any previous change. You might recognize this image. It's an average temperature anomaly since industrialization. And the population of the planet at the same time is unfathomably larger. So consider, for example, that when the Mayans are thought to have succumbed to drought around 8,900, the planet's total population was just 226 million people. And by the mid-1970s, the time scientists began warning in earnest of warming and climate change, the world's population had swelled to 4 billion. Since then, the number of people on the planet has doubled again. More than 8 billion people now inhabit the Earth, and by 2070, the world's population could be somewhere between 9 and 12 billion people. And the data and research suggests that as this happens, people will do what they have done for thousands of years in response to changes in their environment. They will move. In 2018, I set out on a project to understand how the changing climate will again lead the population of the planet to reorganize, to migrate, and to understand the far-reaching implications for stability and for society. I would travel throughout Central America and Mexico and the American South, reporting in rural regions and tagging along with the United Nations World Food Program and other officials there. And I partnered with researchers who had built early models of human migration for the World Bank. And my goal in doing this was twofold. It was to try to assemble a global understanding of the kind of demographic change that might accompany climate change. And it was also to scrape down to the level of human experience to understand how people will live with this change and what it would take to make them move. So first, I want to just take a look at that big picture science. For all those millennia in which people moved in response to their climate, the evidence now shows that they mostly sought out and settled in a very particular environmental set of conditions, conditions that offered a precise range of temperatures and precipitation levels that supported agriculture and later trade and industry. And it's what researchers are now identifying as a climate niche for human habitat. So conveniently, for the past 6,000 years or so, this niche has included much of the globe. But now, as the planet warms, according to this research, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the journal Nature, that niche is shifting toward the poles, and it is shrinking. And much of the world, as that happens, is slowly being displaced from it. Climate change is literally remapping where humans can exist on the planet. And as that happens, people are being left behind or shifted into marginal zones. A few years ago, only a sliver of the Earth's surface, just about 1%, was historically so hot that the researchers described it as uninhabitable. Today, that sliver is expanding quickly across some of the most crowded places on the planet with the fastest rates of population growth. By 2070, and this is what you see in this graphic, about 19% of the Earth will be too hot or too dry uh, and will not have supported traditional life. And that's an area that's home to billions of people. In fact, since 1980, some 600 million people globally have already slipped outside of this climate niche. And by later this century, depending on which trajectory of warming we follow and how much the planet's population grows, between 2 and 6 billion people, or about a third to half of all of humanity, will find themselves in places that for millennia would have been considered inhospitable to human life. Now, not everyone whose environment shifts even outside of that niche will immediately migrate, but we can count on environmental pressures becoming a larger factor in the reasons that people already do migrate. And we can count on the pressures of climate change among these large populations adding to that local upheaval, including insecurity, driving food shortages, and political and armed conflict. This is what happened, for example, with the civil war in Syria, which is related to drought in some of its rural agricultural areas, and then all of the political upheaval that followed that in Europe. And this is just an image of the Syrian diaspora. As the number of people slipping outside of the ideal climate niche shifts from millions to billions, the sheer number of people affected by changing conditions suggests that even if a small fraction of them do leave, the scale of global demographic change could be orders of magnitude larger than researchers have until now projected as possible. And this is how we get to what I think is coming, which is the next great human migration. The World Bank and academic researchers at places like Columbia University have begun to identify a set of hotspots around the world where they expect significant climate migration to emanate from in the future. The bank and most of the other researchers I talk to in this space, they focus on three main regions. There's South Asia, where billions of people depend on agriculture that's fed by fresh water flowing from the Himalayan glaciers that are now disappearing. There's Central America, where I focused so much of my research, traveling north from El Salvador into Guatemala and across the border into Mexico and up to the United States. And then there's North Africa's Sahel, where the 9 countries sandwiched between the Sahara and the humid savanna is probably the most at-risk region on the planet. The Sahel, though, is emblematic of climate migration patterns that we're beginning to see around the world and that we can expect in the future. It illustrates the typical mechanisms for how large populations move and urbanize and ultimately change the nature of cities and societies, whether in Africa or in the United States. In the Sahel, more than 150 million people live there, and nearly half of them depend on subsistence farming to survive. Yet the land is quickly turning to desert. Its trees are cut down for fuel, and its soil is eroding from overuse and poor management. And at the same time, the population is growing faster than almost anywhere else on the planet, stretching its scarce resources further. Each woman in the Sahel, the World Bank estimates, gives birth to about 5 children. And across North Africa, there could be 350 million additional people by 2050. The known water supplies will fall short for tens of millions of people there, and virtually all of them will be displaced from this ideal habitat of the human climate niche. As the bank's chief economist put it to me in very frank terms, it really stretches the imagination to see how this can work. Climate researchers expect migration to follow the same progression for how people have moved in the most vulnerable parts of the world in the past. Migration begins in rural areas, which are often poorest and dependent on fertile soil and abundant water. And then these pastoral lands will begin to empty out. And most people hope to remain as close as possible to home, even when they decide they must move. And so first, perhaps they'll jump to a mid-sized town in search of work while remaining close to family, and then perhaps to a capital city in what researchers call a stepwise fashion of migration. And that rural out-migration will drive a rapid urbanization that could quickly make cities dangerously overcrowded. Take just as one example, the East African megacity of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which the World Bank cites as one alarming example. The population of Addis Ababa has doubled since 2000, and it's on track to double again by 2035. The bank predicts that as the climate worsens, tens of millions more people will arrive there. But then what? Right now, a little more than half of the planet's population lives in urban areas. But by the middle of the century, the bank estimates that 67% of the planet's population will live in cities. Urbanization is a global phenomenon, regardless of wealth, but it's the world's poorest people, the same people, continent by continent, whose ability to feed themselves is most affected by the climate crisis, who are the ones rushing out of rural areas fastest. In Africa, rural to urban migration, according to the World Economic Forum, is happening 11 times faster than it is in Europe. I saw a similar pattern at work when I was reporting in Central America, where coffee and sugarcane farmers in poor highland areas were first making their way to Guatemala City and then ultimately into the caravans leading northward and towards the US border. People move to cities because they can seem like a refuge. They can just as easily, though, become traps. Demand for water and electricity surges, and food, which increasingly needs to be imported, becomes more expensive. The costs then drive the poor into slums. As unemployment rates and poverty rates rise, so does the risk of human trafficking, of domestic abuse, and susceptibility to criminal gangs, and vulnerability to disease. And what happens next is what nations around the world are seeking to avoid most. Criminal groups can become a substitute for government. Slums can become hotbeds for extremism and chaos, ultimately fomenting conflict that can spill outward and destabilize whole regions. By 2030, the bank estimates that 4 out of every 10 urban residents, more than 2 billion people globally, will live in slums. And the International Committee of the Red Cross estimates that almost all of that growth, about 96% of it, is expected in the world's most fragile cities, which are already facing heightened risks of conflict. This is a graphic showing the projected climate-driven outpouring from rural regions into cities in Central America and Mexico. It's based on models that my colleagues and I created in the course of my research, and it aligned with what I found talking to the people that I met in Guatemala's highlands. This is Eva Hernandez. Her husband, Jorge, first considered finding work in cities in Guatemala after drought decimated their crops 3 seasons in a row. And then ultimately, he took their 7-year-old son and he migrated north. And this is what I saw throughout: drought and failed crops, and then parents torn from their children, leaving land that they'd been attached to their entire lives. Their migration was an act of desperation. They only left when they had no other choice. And in the case of Central America, they were all increasingly headed in one direction, and that is towards the United States. So let's talk about the United States. In one man's Eden, as we so recently saw in the fires in Los Angeles or in the flood-ravaged hills of North Carolina, it's also another person's climate nightmare. There is no place in America where we won't also have to deal with climate change. It's inescapable, and large numbers of Americans are also beginning to migrate. I live in Northern California, and in 2020, we were on a run of crazy wildfires. A few years earlier, just about 20 miles from me, a fire had ripped through the city of Santa Rosa. It killed 22 people, and it burned about 3,500 homes just overnight. Then wildfire burned down the town of Paradise, killing 85 people there, and many of them were trapped in their cars trying to escape. And one morning, as the parkland just 12 miles from my home burned, I awoke to smoke so thick that I could hardly see the sun. In California, this became famous to us as sort of the orange day. It felt like a turning point in climate change. At that point, I'd been working on this project for about 2 years. I was guided by the best data and modeling, but I was always focused on other hotspots around the world and other people's challenges. And these fires and this smoke in California, it got me thinking about what it would take to make me move. And what would happen to the United States, too, as this global climate niche shifted. And so that is what became the focus of the next stage of my reporting and of my book, On the Move, about how this era of mass climate migration will forever alter the economy and the demography of the United States also. Now, what I found in the United States is something much more nuanced than what I found elsewhere in the world. Our society is wealthier and it's better equipped. And the climate impacts that I'm about to lay out, as horrific as they sound, are also far less extreme. The US is unlikely to ever face a shortage of food, and so what we're talking about compared to the rest of the world is a matter of degree. And yet, nonetheless, we are on the spectrum of human civilization that will be forced to adapt. And we can expect, in fact, we're already beginning to see the reorganization of population following a similar pattern of stepwise movement, rapid urbanization of places with a consolidation of resources, and the division of wealth and poverty matching up to patterns of resilience and greater vulnerability. For as long as there have been records, the climatic sweet spot in the United States has more or less straddled the middle of this country, stretching from about Appalachia to the Rockies. It's why our Southeast is verdant, why our plains and the Midwest produce $35 billion worth of crops a year and much of the grain to feed the world. But within the next 4 decades, that sweet spot is forecast to shift sharply northward, hovering over the northern Midwest and Chicago. And in an extreme warming scenario, it will move all the way to the border of Canada or perhaps across to the other side of it. The degree of sweeping change in the climate of the US promises to absolutely transform this country's politics and its economy. It's already raising household costs, making daily life more expensive. It's changing and will continue to change work productivity and shift geographic work opportunities. It's dramatically altering the availability of insurance, transforming people's financial vulnerability, and making homeownership both less affordable and less reliable as a way to build wealth. And it will prove more and more expensive to defend against every day into the future, raising the cost of food and goods. In the United States, the choice to migrate in reaction to climate change will be an economic decision, not an environmental one. But what exactly does that look like? This is a scene from Phoenix during a recent heat wave. They had 100 consecutive days above 100 degrees last summer. And here, this is a scene from North Carolina along the coast where established homes on a paved suburban street have been washing out to sea. Not only did I go back to that climate niche in that original research paper to look at the shifting global livability and to understand how that affects where North America fits on that map, but I also went searching for a lot more detail, gathering the best available empirical data on unfolding threats. To do that, I worked with the Rhodium Group, which is an independent economic and environmental research firm, and I mapped their data to see where the specific risks in the United States overlap and to visualize geographically the multiple perils and specific forecasts down to the county level for the entire country. The forecasts that they presented in this data are for very near in the future. Much of it represents a moderate form of rate of climate change affecting us as soon as 2040, just 16 years from now. The threats might seem familiar, but it's different, at least to me, to see them mapped. Wildfires become very large and prevalent across the West, and that by now isn't a surprise. The fires in Los Angeles were apocalyptic, and they've once again refocused our national attention on the extreme risks facing the American West. But in the future, wildfires also become prevalent across the Southeast too. In Florida, for example, as well as South Carolina, we saw last weekend, and even Georgia, these all become hotspots for megafires of the future. This image shows the vulnerability of private property, of residential property. And in the darkest spots on this map is the proportion of homes that stand a 1 in 4 chance of burning over the course of their current 30-year mortgage. In the darkest spots on this map, 95% of properties may burn. And in the lightest spots, 5%. Meanwhile, seas are rising. Sea level rise is modeled to displace some 13 million Americans and to tangentially affect another 80 million living in metropolitan areas that are most deeply affected. And this map shows what that flooding will look like in a couple of the urban places that we know, in San Francisco, in Miami, in Charleston. In Florida, between 1/3 and 2/3 of current housing sits below future tide lines, including as much as 79% of all the structures in Miami-Dade County. And if you think sea level rise only affects the coast, it will also affect tidal river systems, touching places like Jackson, Mississippi, 150 miles inland, And it affects places like Atlanta, because those places on the coast, those places displaced on the coast move inland, and people there are often drawn to cities, increasing the population in those cities, but also sending ripple effects ahead of them in the form of gentrification, displacement of the poor, and higher demand for services and infrastructure. And then, of course, there's extreme heat. In all the years of recorded weather, extreme heat days in the United States above 130 degrees were so rare that fewer than 2,000 Americans experienced a week of it in a year. But by 2050, 6 million Americans might experience that level of extreme heat annually. And that has implications for their health, for productivity, and for basic safety. And when you have extreme heat, you also have humidity and crop loss. And that's what we see in these maps here. Crop failure and extraordinary wet bulb temperatures spread across the southernmost part of the continental US, and they pierce it right up through the middle. In parts of South Texas and the Great Plains, crop failures could be near total, or about 90%. And up the Mississippi River Valley, it will begin to feel in summertime the way southern Louisiana feels now. It might be unsafe to play high school football, or for gardeners or road crews to work outside. Factories and indoor workplaces will require air conditioning, something that buildings aren't built for today, and which can cost tens of millions of dollars to retrofit. So all of these threats, of course, they don't exist in isolation. They're compounding and they're overlapping and they're amplifying one another. And as they do, they're beginning to transform the comfort and the safety and the livability of vast parts of this country. These maps, when you put them all together, they tell a story of a nation with the walls closing in around it. Pretty much the entire southern third of the United States slips into these marginal zones of the climate niche, and in some cases begins to fall outside of it. In the long run, that will fundamentally alter the economies of this country. It promises a thorough transformation of the quality of life of people here and the viability of great regions where labor productivity is projected to shift dramatically, decreasing 20% in some places because of extreme heat, and where the cost of energy and the demand for it will shift as well, rising sharply where cooling becomes a necessity for survival. And farming across much of this country will never be the same. So look at the map on the right. Crop yields in the heartland drop between 30 and 90% is what's reflected there. And that's labor decline on the left, which drops by 10 to 20%. Household energy costs in the South rise around 10%. Mortality rates increase in the North, even when modest jumps in temperature are pronounced, even modest effects in temperature have pronounced effects on mortality. And violent crime patterns change as well, because social researchers associate larger populations and warming winter temperatures with more activity. These data are all empirically connected to climate change, and they're known factors in driving human migration. They come from a partnership of the nation's top social and economic scientists at UC Berkeley, at Rutgers University, at Stanford University. And all of this adds up to a cumulative economic strain. Nationally, economists estimate now that a loss of 1.2% of US GDP can be expected for every degree of Celsius of warming from here on out. But at the county level, which is what this map shows, the GDP decline might be at a much faster rate. Look at the bottom of this map. In some Florida and Louisiana counties, namely the ones in the Big Bend area, which were just recently affected by Hurricane Helene, where GDP could drop by as much as 60% each year. That would turn those counties into economic dead zones, losing more than they can produce until they go bankrupt. We're already now starting to hear the early alarms of this kind of economic strain. We hear them in the near bankruptcy of federal aid programs like FEMA or the National Flood Insurance Program. And we hear them in the alarming tales of unaffordable or unavailable property insurance. So where will people go? As the climate niche sweet spot in the United States shifts sharply northward, climate models and migration data suggest that somewhere between 13 and 160 million people, up to half of all Americans, will face that kind of degrading environment that has driven historical climate-influenced migrations. For comparison, the Dust Bowl led to the migration of about 3 million people. And America's Great Migration out of the South saw about 7 million Black Americans move northward. Each of these periods transformed the identity and the culture of this country. So what then does the next great migration look like for American society? This is, of course, a mixture of good news and bad. There's opportunities for growth and innovation, and there will be loss and decline and potential conflict. On one of several trips that I made to the state of Louisiana in the course of reporting for this project, I drove a stretch of county road south from the city of Houma toward the southernmost coast of the United States. It was a land of rising seas and destroyed homes, battered by hurricanes that were arriving too frequently to build back from. And near the end of the road, I crossed a levee and entered the small battered community of Ile-de-Jean-Charles, which has just, or had at that time, 29 remaining residents. I stopped at a 3-bedroom, mid-60s house. It was thrust into the air on 20-foot stilts, an acknowledgement of the unstoppable water. And in the front yard, a hand-painted sign faced the road that just said, "Climate change sucks." The land in southern Louisiana is sinking, and it's one of the greatest and fastest examples of dramatic climate-driven change in the United States. It's a rare combination there of subsidence and sea level that's accelerating the effects that many other parts of coastal America are soon to face. And the state is losing more than 35 square miles of land each year. Ile-de-Jean-Charles was an indigenous community where Biloxi and Chitimacha and Choctaw people had either lived for centuries or fled there in the early 1800s when the southern states drove them west on the Trail of Tears. And the home that I had stopped in front of belonged to a Choctaw man named Chris Brunet, whose family was 5th generation on the Isle. Brunet described to me a place from his childhood that I had to imagine because it no longer existed. Open grasslands where horses galloped along a low-lying prairie. He told me of walking to a place called Lake Tambor, which he would fish at with his father. But now, as I looked where he pointed, water was everywhere. I gazed out across the Gulf of Mexico towards where this freshwater lake had been, and Brunet told me he thought that all of this place could have been saved. The levee that I'd crossed, for example, was part of a state and Army Corps of Engineers project to protect certain parts of the Louisiana coast from flooding and rising seas. But some places, including Ile-de-Jean-Charles, had been deemed not economically worth saving. One of the great perils, right here's that close-up of Brunet's house. One of the great perils of climate change is that the hardship will be divided unequally along the same dividing lines that have already defined so much of our society. Climate change is expected to cleave open the divide between rich and poor, between communities of color and white ones, between urban and rural ones. It will exacerbate and underscore the inequalities created by redlining, by discriminatory development and investment, by unequal mortgage rates and interest rates. Studies show that redline neighborhoods in major American cities have 30 to 40% fewer trees. And in parts of Los Angeles, where oppressive heat has become an annual killer, those treeless neighborhoods are 10 degrees hotter than the leafy, wealthier ones just a mile away. Research, including some from Atlanta, show that poor neighborhoods are less likely to have or to use air conditioning because they can't afford the cost of turning them on. And that decision sometimes also has deadly consequences. Studies also show that poor and minority communities are more likely to flood catastrophically, as they did in Houston in 2017, because they have not received the sort of past investments in infrastructure, like upgraded water treatment plants or urban drainage and catchment basins, that many wealthier and whiter neighborhoods received. And they'll struggle to catch up on that funding as they'll struggle to catch up as funding for those efforts become harder to obtain, falling more quickly behind in the future. Mobility itself is a function of wealth and age and energy and opportunity. And so while we can expect a flight of a certain number of able people or wealthy people, many, many more will remain where they are by choice, or they'll be trapped in those places and they will be left behind. The risk is that some of those places will face a spiral of decline. Collapsing tax bases will lead to worse infrastructure, higher climate risks, poorer schools, and fewer jobs, ultimately lowering home values more and eroding the assets of its residents. And then more people leave, and that cycle perpetuates. The poor, the elderly especially, will be left behind. One researcher I work with has modeled the echo effects of climate migration in the US, finding that as younger people leave these communities, the average age of residents in the hardest hit parts of the United States will jump by 10 to 15 years. This is an image of the town of Ordway, Colorado. It was this once wealthy farming community that's become a case study in decline since the 1990s, when the farmers there lost access to their water. Their population shifted. Most people left to nearby cities like Denver and Colorado Springs, and their youth are now a diaspora around the country, having left for college or to other opportunities and never returned. So Ordway is a harbinger for how other rural communities across the country may be strained in the very near future, many of which are modeled to age, as I said, and to decrease in prosperity and per capita income. And that will all have profound implications for rural discontent, for rising extremism in the United States, and for the social pressures that we've just seen manifest in so much discontent in this last election. So one huge set of challenges is around how policymakers and leaders and companies support those shrinking communities and adjust to create future possibilities. How do we plan and facilitate anti-growth so that communities can shrink but not necessarily decline, remaining proportional to the economic activity that can realistically support them? How do we diversify economies that are not disproportionately dependent on higher risk sectors? And how do we decide which places, especially smaller towns and rural communities, are worth protecting when funds are finite and which ones are not? The flip side, of course, is the potential for growth and opportunity in many of the places protected from all of these changes that I'm describing. And these are the places that people are likely to wind up. Because as the climate niche slides northward, many places in the north actually stand to benefit in certain ways. This is an image from a Stanford University study projecting per capita GDP growth of 200 to 450% in the northern latitudes of the world. Russia or Canada, which have abundant land but need more people, could see a great leap in prosperity as the climate warms. And in the US too, we can expect some states in the northern part of the country to prosper because of all the things that we've been talking about. Energy will be cheaper, labor will be easier, their land remains fertile, etc. So the models and the data that I look at suggest a population shift in the United States towards these relative safe havens, which will be in the Northeast, in the Great Lakes, and to a lesser degree in the Pacific Northwest. These places will also see climate change. There's no place that will escape that. They'll see floods and mega rain events and heat and toxic algae and wildfire smoke, but they also have ample water. The Great Lakes holds 20% of the planet's remaining freshwater surface supply. And they don't face these main threats like the big wildfires, hurricanes, and coastal flooding. In some cases, they also have ample infrastructure. Cities like Detroit, throughout the Rust Belt, Cleveland, Ohio, they have abundant housing and systems that were built for, or at least zoned for, populations that are much larger than those that are there today. And they're anticipating the growth that could come from this migration. Cities like Cincinnati and Buffalo and Duluth and Ann Arbor, they all have robust planning programs now evolving around this idea of climate in-migration. More broadly, these parts of the country would see an increase in crop yields and lower and longer growing season. That will make their economies more steady or even help them see an increase in GDP. Heating and energy costs will be cheaper relative to the South, where they are expected to skyrocket. And meanwhile, other places in the South, from Atlanta in the East to Phoenix in the West, they're unlikely to empty out, but they may begin to urbanize and to consolidate as people gravitate towards services and a tax base that can support them. So these cities, whether it's Phoenix or Houston, they could grow. They could become urban islands in vast, harder hit rural regions. Atlanta will likely continue to grow as well on its explosive growth trajectory, both because it's a nexus of services and communities and critical mass of tax resources for the entire Southeast, but also because that growth reinforces itself with more opportunity and because improvements like parks and green belts and new jobs and new industry keep it attractive. So all of this presents its own set of challenges, mainly around urban growth and planning. How do you support the needs of a growing influx of population so that you avoid the trend of deepening urban poverty? The researchers who modeled the aging of communities left behind point out that for every 1,000 people who move to a place like Atlanta and then have children and build businesses that draw more workers and so on, the net future effect may be 10 to 50 times larger. Atlanta, which is poised to be a regional destination as people migrate away from Florida and the vulnerable coastline, has made great investments in greener infrastructure and durable systems like parks. In some cases, though, is only to find that adaptation has driven new waves of extreme gentrification and inequality. So communities need housing and transit and good schools. These are the same old challenges, but they're amplified in this new climate migration context. How this all plays out depends on decisions that businesses and policymakers are making right now. For one, cutting emissions now directly affects the severity of all of the changes that I'm talking about. That human climate niche study, drop emissions to meet the Paris targets, and the estimates for the number of people pushed outside of the climate niche globally can drop by 80%. And in the US, that might mean that that sweet spot holds in the central part of this country. So we can limit the downside, and with correct policy, we can steer the upside. We've seen a glimpse of how how effective that policy can be. Some of the laws and pledges made over the past 4 years have shown the enormous potential to slow the consequences of warming and to mitigate the rising costs and threats to individual people here. Some of them have been extremely effective. 80% of new energy installation last year was renewable. And the EV battery market has taken off in the US thanks to billions of dollars in subsidies made available in just the past 2 years. So whether our cities of the future look like refugee camps or whether they look like full occupancy, thriving new communities that are driving economic vibrancy, it depends on smart growth, and it depends on planning, on forethought about housing stock in particular, housing that's affordable and efficient. It depends on policies to provide affordable energy and expand new employment and protect against the shocks of disasters and environmental change. And these aren't really new things. These are familiar challenges. They'll be expensive, but we know how to do it. It's just work that's pretty well defined, straightforward, and well within our technological abilities. And so that's the final thought that I want to leave you with today, that while the changes to climate environmental policy underway politically now are very alarming, and the political headwinds are immense, there are still opportunities in this change. And they depend on us doing good work that we already, as a country, are very good at doing. Thank you, and look forward to discussion and answering your questions.
Thank you, Abrahm. Thank you for both the sobering, very sobering work, but ending on a somewhat positive note. So with that, yes, please stop sharing your screen. And I want to invite Jairo to come up, reconnect the two of you. And we're going to get the camera also showing us. So where's my notes? There's so much to think about, to talk about. I thought we would begin now by bringing Dr. Jairo Garcia up to the stage. Jairo is faculty in the School of City and Regional Planning here at Georgia Tech, but had just written the City of Atlanta's Climate Action Plan when Abrahm interviewed him for the book back in 2018. Jairo, Abrahm says you were pretty shocked then that he was telling you that there was an estimated 550,000 potential new climate migrants coming to I assume the Atlanta region, not exactly doubling the city of Atlanta, but and that at that time, that wasn't part of the Climate Action Plan. Was the Climate Action Plan at that point just mostly about mitigation of climate change? Tell us a bit about what you now think a Climate Action Plan should be doing relative to climate migration.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation, Elena. Thank you, you all that are here. Aram, good to see you again. Thank you so much. I really enjoy reading your book. Definitely, you make an accurate and very compelling argument about what is happening with the cities in the United States. When I put the climate action plan, you said it right. Climate action plan is mitigation. However, there are many mitigation actions that are served as an adaptation or resiliency. That was the next step in order to, when I was continuing my work as a director of climate policies with the city of Atlanta, I implemented the climate action plan to reduce the craziness that we are doing to the environment. Because if we keep putting more carbon, it's going to get harder and harder and harder. So we need to stop the craziness first. Then we need to figure out how we can adapt to what is happening. So generally, cities, what they do is first the climate action plan to reduce the carbon emissions. The next step is to work in a climate resilience and adaptation plan. That was my plan. So I get a big grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, more than $1 million to put a plan together. And then when you call $1 million, there are a lot of people that wants the money. And then that was the first presidency of Donald Trump, so my position was eliminated. So I couldn't continue my work. But I was lucky for me, for Atlanta, because the city and regional planning called me. And then I am be able to do without any funding except my salary as a part-time faculty to do the work that I wanted to do with the city of Atlanta, which is the resilience plan. So I've been doing that with whatever the resources that I have, with minimum resources that I have, trying to call the attention, the problem that we have in Atlanta about resiliency. So I've been elaborating climate vulnerabilities for counties. As you mentioned, the majority of migration are coming to the metro area, not specifically the city of Atlanta, but the metro area. Regardless, it's going to affect us. But I've been working in resilience plans for Clayton County, DeKalb County, Cobb County. Right now, we are working with Gwinnett County with my students with zero budget, but I believe that this work is important. And that the climate adaptation vulnerability assessments is the foundation for the climate adaptation and resilience plan, which is the one that we should be putting together. But the good thing that I was able to do when I was with the city of Atlanta, that we have a fantastic commissioner of planning, was to get in the ears of Tim King, at the time was the commissioner of planning, and Ryan Gravel, who is the one who collaborated with Tim King to put this amazing comprehensive plan for the city of Atlanta in 2017, which include the migration that we were, the scientists that are working in demographics are telling us that it's going to be for the city of Atlanta. So in order to resume the answer for your questions, I'm still working on that with zero money. Last week here at the library, I have the city of Atlanta and the Atlanta Regional Commission. And again, I'm keep poking, and hopefully somebody, I'm knocking in doors like did Dan Gravel with the bell line to hopefully somebody listen to pay attention, and then we can work in the issues that we should be working on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jairo, for doing that. And I know, yes, my studios also, I work with the real communities and to try to address issues, but is it enough? Is it, so I want to turn to Camille and Matt to bring them in. Camille Cortes and Matt Lambert into the conversation. Both are brilliant activist, new urbanist designers in the Portland, Oregon office of CPZ-CoDesign, where Matt is a partner. And they have both been leaders in PLACE Initiative, which Camille founded in 2020. And so Camille is going to tell us what PLACE is about. And we'll then I think we'll be able to kind of try to compare a bunch of different strategies and what folks are trying to do at this point relative to climate migration. So Camille, welcome. And why don't you share your screen?
Hi, everyone. Ellen, thank you so much for that introduction. Abrahm, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for inviting us here and to speak about PLACE Initiative. Although climate change has become a central focus, solutions still underestimate how critical urbanism is to real climate solutions. Urbanism shapes cities, towns, rural areas, and natural environments as interconnected systems, coordinating the built environment, mobility, social networks, economic activities, and ecological landscapes. By encouraging compact, walkable cities and neighborhoods and efficient public transit, Urbanism lowers emissions and conserves land. It also protects floodways, enables protective infrastructure, and supports equitable growth. When communities expand, whether from climate migration or other factors, urbanism helps preserve resources, provide housing and jobs, and keeps environmental impacts in check. At PLACE Initiative, we see prioritizing urbanism as vital to a holistic, effective climate response. We aim to help communities deliver bottom-up, locally led actions that strengthen local economies, ensure long-term prosperity, and build resilient places. Local strength is necessary to adapt to threats and to accommodate migration. Building local strength requires collaboration between numerous disciplines like planning, environmental policy, transportation, health, economics, and urban design, as well as coordinated action between municipalities, regional agencies, nonprofits, private sector companies, and residents. PLACE Initiative proposes that change requires shared focus between these disparate groups and stems from local action. In order to appeal to those groups, bridge the urban to rural divide, and bridge political divides, we've developed PLACE principles, a series of multidisciplinary goals that coordinate change in order to build local strength and establish a path towards resilience. This holistic climate action framework aims to advance equitable climate solutions for all communities and geographies, and crafting language that avoids polarization is key to success. Our Climate Receiver Places project was established to address climate migration and specifically to ensure that resulting growth doesn't contribute to future harm. Initially, migration will be local, then regional, interstate, and so on. We've chosen to focus on the long term. However, the solutions we've developed are applicable to local and regional levels as well. The scale of change has been discussed, and it needs to be further elevated. From an urbanism perspective, we find it helpful to relate to other periods of rapid change and expansion, such as the westward expansion of the US. This map catalogs the 765 new towns and cities built by the Mormons over 100 years, built on their plat of Zion. The Spanish Law of the Indies was similarly used to structure rapid growth during Spain's colonial period. Adapting to climate change will require a similar scale of growth and systems to structure it. Presently, we've focused on evolving existing towns and cities in regions where future climate risk is relatively low. If we don't change the way growth happens, the problem will only perpetuate. This requires local strength, meeting communities where they're at, and building further capacity. New cities will be a necessary further step, but existing places are the nucleus of future regions. Climate receiver places have relatively low future climate-related risks due to their location and geography, as well as having existing bones of historic urban fabric that can act as the nucleus of a larger future city. Viable future regions already host a number of medium and large cities, but many of those larger cities have depopulated over the past century. For these places, like Cincinnati, growth offers hope for an economic revival. Some places, like Atlanta, which you'll recognize on this map, have a different set of issues to grapple with, struggling with the results of 20th century growth patterns, yet facing a significant prospect of new growth. These long-term future regions are where we've focused our attention, places with relatively low future risk from sea level rise, extreme heat, wet bulb temperature, fire, crop yields, and other major climate challenges. While local movement will occur first, the scale of change needed in policy, governance, and the built environment requires focused action well ahead of time. We've developed and continue to refine materials to identify where migration will head and how to address that growth at a local and regional scale. We are also working on an assessment and certification to incentivize action and also market opportunities to draw future residents and businesses. We've engaged with the Appalachian Regional Commission to assess the capacity and opportunities as the region is working to shift its economy away from coal. This has underscored the need to meet places where they are, determining the opportunities and solutions to build local strength, which is necessary to establish future capacity. In one county, we found that hyper-local self-reliance is a necessary first step to build up the representation and viable local governance necessary to tackle further issues. And in another county, we found that regional economy could spread opportunity to smaller places, but needs strategies to cluster major employment and support and grow local business. Establishing and reinforcing nodes of active, diverse business areas is a means to support community interaction, building towards viable local governance that will be necessary to also tackle further issues. For many smaller communities, growth represents hope for building prosperity. In contrast, large urban areas often grapple with strains on infrastructure and resources from 20th century growth dynamics. Despite these differences, both settings rely on strong local capacity to tackle broader challenges. In big cities, the starting point typically involves coordinating efforts across multiple agencies and organizations, focusing on the fundamentals of urban economics, urban design, and public health, later building capacity to handle regional infrastructure and growth management. You have to support current residents equitably in order to grow successfully. The PLACE principles are designed to coordinate action across scale and jurisdiction to build resilient cities, towns, and regions, emphasizing the intersection of urbanism, climate, and equity. As a volunteer-led organization, we've developed this approach at a great deal of change is needed, and we must act now. While the action needed is complex, we believe it can be simplified and scaled to meet community capacity and organizational interest, and that these mostly small-scale actions simply need to fit within a broader framework. Thank you.
I'll jump in and add. Thanks for all that, Camille. I'll add a couple of examples that come to mind from the discussion. One, Abrahm talking about the initial sort of rural movement in a lot of places. Yet interestingly enough, thinking about sea level rise in coastal U.S. Making quite a difference in that situation most likely. So we'll be with the CNU Congress in Rhode Island talking a lot about coastal flooding and threats to sort of major cities, major economies. And it comes to mind that that at this point they're not really starting to think about, say, how we build up the local and regional economy around Manchester, New Hampshire, for instance, as those will need to migrate inland in the early stages of climate migration and accommodate population. But there's a lot of, sort of what we point out or the reason we point out on our maps, those existing cities is that they have the opportunity to grow. But as Camille pointed to in more rural conditions, which is another place that we've thought to focus. It's sort of interesting in the sort of opposite direction of the sort of disinvestment in rural areas and the strife that could create, but also looking at the opportunity that could be provided to, say, rural areas in the north. So we're looking at that and trying to find the right language to approach that. So that it's not a threat, but seen as an opportunity, an economic opportunity for them, as you point out. And lastly, I just want to touch on the broader, longer term, not sort of first wave of migration, but the longer term migration. A sort of major concern that we've had is building up that capacity, as Camille said, from that local level where we find, especially in small communities, there's very little capacity. There may be almost no municipal government whatsoever, maybe 1, 2, 3 people at most in the entire municipal government. So you don't have the capacity to prepare for the sorts of changes that we need to prepare for. But we want to sort of find the strategies to build up that local capacity, because if we grow in those regions by the numbers that we're talking about, that has a significant potential threat on our future agricultural systems, because we'll be growing in our future prime agricultural lands and degrading watersheds and so forth. So it's sort of a coordinated system we see at that local smallest level, that creating that nucleus of government capacity and resident capacity to successfully interact with governance. And that's one of our big points in our principles is to foster good governance, because that's going to be incredibly important to be able to build that local capacity and the regional capacity for change.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt and Camille. Abrahm, so you've sort of got, these different scales of Matt and Camille really trying to work with rural communities, doing this on a volunteer basis. And then Jairo also really using his students as volunteers to work with some of the local outer suburban communities outside of Atlanta, pretty sprawling and car dependent. And then you're saying, but that really everyone's going to end up moving to the big cities. So what do you make of these different scales of intervention? I mean, they're all needed, I suppose, but give us your thoughts.
Yeah, I think they're complementary, not contradictory. I mean, it's first of all, there's no argument for de-investing or abandoning rural communities. It's more a pragmatic realization that a declining tax base will leave them short-funded to invest in the kind of resilience adaptation infrastructure that is going to be extraordinarily expensive and will be a challenge for larger cities to afford. And so, when I talk to experts who talk about making those communities proportional to their income, it's more about expanding their vibrancy and making them more stable and more resilient, and not just sort of shrinking them or punishing them in any way, but investing in a proportional level. And the big metro city growth challenges, I think, are I tend to think of the issues we're talking about as like the spur that's finally kicking into action, things that people have known for a long time that they need to do even without climate change. And that's in a way that's part of the story of everything that we're doing to adapt to climate change is too slowly getting up to speed with responsible things that make for smart growth and pleasant communities in the future and greener communities in the future and so forth. There's a huge transition from when I started having these conversations in 2021 with a lot of these cities. Ann Arbor stood out as one of the only places I talked to that was really like actively thinking about it, and now it's much more common, and there's lots of people working in the space and contributing to the space, and so I think we're starting to see momentum, and that's a really healthy, positive shift in the right direction.
Yeah, if I had to add, so I just want to complement what Abraham said, that we know the majority of people, according to the data that we have collected, are going to be moved to the metro area. That is correct. However, we had to have in focus that the center of economic prosperity in the area is the heart of the city, Atlanta. So even though the people move to the suburbs, in one way or the other, it's affected the city, and the city is affected the suburbs. So as Abraham mentioned, the idea is not that those people need to be displaced to the cities. The idea is how you can adapt those cities, make those cities resilient, to be sure that they are able to, for instance, commute to Atlanta. One of the emphasis in our vulnerability assessment is what about public transportation? Because we need to somehow alleviate the problem of traffic inside the city of Atlanta. How they are using water, because we share the water with the metro area, or any other resource, electricity, etc. So the idea is how we collaborate, the city of Atlanta and the rest of the metro area, to address those issues.
Well, and I'm going to open it up to Q&A here, and I'm in Slido, and there's a lot of people asking about the political questions, because obviously there's an issue there. I know, Matt, you want to respond, but I'm jumping to Q&A here. The most liked question is by Anonymous, has asked, how do we combat the rise in anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiment that has been growing in the Western world? Does anybody, I mean, in the course of community meetings, in the course of, this is sort of what planners do, is deal with conflict resolution and try to help folks get over some of those anti-sentiments. What else is that? What else should we be doing, or doing it better?
So yeah, it's a sentiment that happens everywhere. It's not just in the United States. As we see, for instance, in Germany recently, the center-right won just because of that sentiment. And then, all the pressure that is happening in Italy and other countries, even the Netherlands. So I truly believe the first thing that we need to do is to educate people. And I'm gonna, just look at that. I'm gonna start to promote Abraham book to everybody who want to read it, to make it aware that the majority of migration is not happening to developed countries. The majority of migration is happening inside the countries. That's the huge majority. Just a small minority is going to those countries. That's the first thing. Once people understand that, then he says, we need to focus on the migration inside the country. Is that okay if the people from New Orleans move to Atlanta? You have any problem with that? And then it's probably not racism, but that's another story. But we need to be emphasized that even though a small fraction of the people are migrating to countries in the north, the huge majority of the people are staying in their countries or close where they can live. So to make the life in those countries better for those people is one way to address those issues. But it definitely has to be an issue of education, and then send a message to everybody to understand that how the migration is happening.
Any other thoughts from the panel? Matt?
I'll just add one thing that we've thought to be essential and haven't really gotten as far as we'd like to, but that's our sort of blind spot in terms of local and regional economic development, and finding ways to really elevate. That's where we say that you have to support the people that live there today sufficiently to be able to grow in the future, and that has a lot to do with ensuring that we have economic opportunity for folks, like I said, that are there today, and growing in such a way that they can recognize that there's opportunity for more to join in to that pie. I think there's a lot of, it's that perception of threat that is difficult, but it's true that we haven't really focused on economic opportunity at the local level in this country as much as we need to.
Absolutely. I mean, that it's very clear, certainly, immigration has always tended to fuel all kinds of growth. And, there's also so many examples where it is opportunity, and yet, and you can look in people's own personal lives and they'll tell their stories, but it's somehow we don't always get that across. We don't have much time left. But I want to ask each of you, I'll give you a second to think about it. Georgia Tech is a top research university. So I'd like to close by asking you to provide some advice, perhaps even a request, to the students within the wide range of problems and opportunities raised by climate change and climate migration. What is a particular research question you'd like to see the next generation tackle? We've got lots of students who have to do theses and option papers and dissertations. What's the next big question and who wants to go first? One question that I would love to get resolved is how do we stop the brainwashing of people when they feel fear? How we can make data in the mind of people instead of misinformation. I think misinformation is one of the biggest issues. This election, I mean, as we can tell, it was about misinformation. Immigrants, they use the immigrants as peons in order to win the election. How we can stop the craziness? There has to be somewhere in which we can get in the mind of people to don't accept just what they believe, but what the data is showing you. Alternate facts versus science, perhaps? Yes. Yeah. What can we do? Yeah, absolutely. All right. Who else? Abrahm.
And in no particular order of importance, but I think a lot about insurance and the economic implications of what's happening these days, and I wonder often, if there isn't a new paradigm to be arrived at, and so students might look at cooperative insurance or microfinance insurance options and how something like that might work if you lower the overhead and take the, the profit making interest out of the equation if there isn't a more sustainable longer term model. And that's one of those just key, tripod legs that is undermining the economic stability of communities. So it's wonky, but it's important.
We like wonky. We're good with wonky. All right, Matt.
Well, to play off of that, since I had a blank stare for a second, which is basically to look at alternative means of organizing and building both housing and business. So that's, Abraham talked about micro insurance, and there's microfinancing, but also other means of supporting and building housing at the cooperative level, government means of supporting that through things like community land trusts and land banks, and how those could work together, but also from a business standpoint in terms of supporting local economic development from the community up basis that's connected to the sort of larger scale separate economic development that we typically see folks focus on.
Camille.
I'd like to see more of the qualitative data, focused on how migration is happening locally, and hearing more of the stories of what is prompting people to move, because we are looking at this on, such a broad scale. And I think that we don't have enough research at the local level, and just the need to work locally, I think, is more important than ever as, governmental funds are strained in this area of work. I think it proves that local impact is really strong, and having that bottom up action is very important.
All right. And a last question from the Q&A. How can people support climate research like this financially? Which organizations are good to donate to? And now I think, PLACE Initiative would obviously be one I would recommend, but Abrahm, do you have some, can you add a few others to the list?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our universities should be funded by non-corporate interests, and that's hard to do because individual donors would have to reach some kind of effective scale, but maybe there's a consolidation mechanism, and then that money goes to universities to allow more freedom in choosing which directions of research university departments go in, so they're not always tailored to the biggest donors.
So we have a new center here at the School of City and Regional Planning. It's called the Center of Resilience and Adaptation. And then obviously we are always searching for money. So that would be a great way to collect data and then show what is happening and all the research questions that we're talking about, finance students to do this kind of research. So universities are a good way to support that research.
I think all of that is a great note to end on. So I am afraid we are out of time. Thank you, Abrahm, Jairo, Camille, Matt. Thanks to all of our attendees. You've been listening to episode 41 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. A video and podcast of this event will be posted to the Redesigning Cities website. And now I'd like to invite all of you in person to continue the discussion at the reception upstairs in the Cohen Gallery. We have a lovely spread of food to entice you to linger and engage in further conversation about this and other topics related to redesigning cities. Thank you, thank you, thank you.